Welcome to Crossroads. In today's episode, we'll be talking about whether democracy is actually at risk in the 2024 elections, not just for the U.S., but apparently like 70% of the countries in the world. News outlets are suggesting right now, the big corporate media, that 2024 could be the global end of democracy as we know it, and uncensored news and information is being framed as risks to this global democracy. What is actually happening? Well, let's discuss. Look, a new narrative is being rolled out in the debates over the 2024 U.S. presidential elections, and after President Biden called former President Trump a threat to democracy in a recent speech. I know he's been saying this a lot, but there's a recent one. Corporate news outlets began publishing a steady stream of articles based on this narrative. Now look, if we go by Bloomberg, it appears that the elections themselves are a threat to democracy, at least how they're saying it. Bloomberg said this: 2024 is the year of elections, and that's a threat to democracy. The year of elections is a threat to democracy. What do they mean? Well, they claim this. They say, so where does that leave us today? Look at the world in 2024, and it is almost a mirror image of 2016, according to these two individuals they're citing. And they continue by stating, the long-shot unthinkables from 8 years ago are now the firm favorites or even just the accepted status quo. Odds makers put Trump's re-election chances at close to 40%, with Joe Biden nearly 10 percentage points back. It notes as well further in that 41% of the world's population is having major elections. Sorry, 41%, not 70. And they say, yay, democracy, right? And they say, not really. What with extremist populist parties, mostly right-wing, on the rise everywhere from European Union to the Pacific Rim. Let me just dig into this a bit, right? They're saying that the elections happening, and again, 41% of the world right now, are themselves a threat to democracy. Now, how is an election a threat to democracy? I don't know, given the fact that you're talking about the democratic process through which people elect their leaders. And they note that, well, what is this big threat? And then they start talking directly about, well, the threat is a similar situation to 2016. As they note, it is almost a mirror image of 2016. What does that mean? That was, of course, the year that Donald J. Trump was elected President of the United States. And they note that the essential threat to democracy they're talking about is the potential reality that Trump could be reelected. Again, chances at close to 40% as they're noting. And they note as well that the big problem the world is facing with this global threat to democracy and the possible end to democracy itself is not an actual end to democracy, but instead that the election process may elect people who are what they say extremist populist parties, mostly right-wing. In other words, they're saying it's a threat to global democracy because conservatives may actually win some places this year. That's what they're saying. Further in, they say, as for Europe, John and Adrian warn that in a terrifying number of cases, candidates who would have been seen as extremist wild cards in 2016 look the strongest, with likely advances in the European Parliament, Austria, Portugal, and Germany. And what do they mean by this? These extremist wild cards, who would have seen them as such? Well, mostly just the big corporate press and, of course, the left wing, which frames the right wing as extremist. And, you know, being fair, the right wing frames the left wing as a pretty extreme also. It depends which side you're on. Now, look, imagine that. Allowing people to vote in an election is a threat to democracy. Briefly, I would agree with them on one point, which is that they say the elections in Taiwan do represent a threat to democracy. I would agree with that. You know, I'm actually in Taiwan reporting live right now. I'll be here till next Tuesday. Look, if one party wants to fold to the Chinese Communist Party, acknowledging or saying that they're not even a country, essentially, that's one of the big arguments in Taiwan, interestingly, with their political debates right now. One party has been talking about, you know, independence, that Taiwan is a sovereign nation, And the Chinese Communist Party has taken some issue with that because the CCP regards Taiwan as being part of China. And the other party, the KMT, the Kuomintang, is saying that the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, saying that Taiwan is a country, is provoking China, and this is leading the country towards the possibility of war. If your political position is arguing that you can't even call yourself a country, I'd say that does possibly represent the end of democracy, especially if it means a gradual moving towards being under the CCP, which is a communist country. So, in a real sense, I would agree on that. That in Taiwan, you might actually see a real end to democracy, but that's not an extremist right-wing position. That's a communist position. And if people vote to end their country, that is an end to democracy, at least for Taiwan. But the issue, in my opinion, taken this broader context of what this news piece is actually talking about, and notably what a lot of other media are saying right now, not just about Taiwan, but about the United States, Europe, and a lot of other countries on Earth. The big issue, in my opinion, is that this Bloomberg piece, and interestingly again, many others being published by other outlets almost just like this very recently, are grouping all of these political leaders, into the same camp who just simply in most cases oppose far left policies. And personally, I don't think they're actually talking about democracy when they're saying that these folks are a threat to democracy. I don't think by any means that Trump is a threat to democracy. I don't think that a lot of the other conservative politicians coming in are threats to democracy. In fact, in Europe, most of the right-wing, political leaders are still pretty dang far left. It's just that they maybe oppose, open borders and so on like that. But they're saying this is a threat to democracy. They're talking about the threat of actual democracy, right? They're talking about this to the current status quo of the political establishment. They're suggesting that if you oppose these, the trans agenda or the, very woke agenda sweeping the world right now, or you just believe a country should have functioning borders, then you're an extremist and a threat to democracy. This is the unfortunate way this narrative is being spun. And look, it's not just Bloomberg's opinion writers saying this either. You could say, oh, it's just Bloomberg and one person's opinion. It's not just them. There's been a whole lot of articles almost within a very short time span saying almost the exact same thing. I'm just going to show you some of these. Look, The Atlantic claims that democracy may not even survive this time around. Democracy might die in darkness, as the Washington Post would suggest. But The Atlantic says this. They're saying lots of people will vote this year. That does not mean democracy will survive. And they say voting will take place in more than 60 countries this year, an unprecedented number containing roughly half of the global population. But even with all this, voting democracy is under severe threat, endangered by predatory politicians who rig elections and disgruntled voters willing to hand over power to autocratic leaders. Imagine, folks, a political party willing to rig elections. What would the world do if a political party were to rig an election? Gee, have we seen such a thing before? Well, The Atlantic is saying maybe not, but it might just happen. And they're saying that the most pivotal elections will take place in November. Well, election in November being the U.S. election. And they're saying that's when the world's most powerful democracy, the United States, they're suggesting, decides whether to turn itself over to an avowedly authoritarian demagogue. They're, of course, referring to Donald J. Trump. Now, I don't personally know if Donald Trump is an avowedly authoritarian demagogue, but this is journalism according to The Atlantic. And look, imagine that. When have we ever seen the rigging of elections? And I would agree that if you rig an election, you're a threat to democracy. Maybe we've seen that before. I don't know. Maybe that the threats to democracy are already in existence. And, it depends on which side of the aisle you're on. And I'd say also, I'd agree that if you weaponize the justice system to go after your political opponents, you might just be an avowedly authoritarian demagogue. But again, this is a question of basic reality they're raising here. They're saying this is not a problem yet, but it could be. And so to prevent the threat to democracy, we need to eliminate the democratic process through which people can choose to vote for the person they want to by striking that person's name from the ballot itself. Only by not allowing people to engage in democracy can we save democracy. This is what they're saying, in my opinion. And look, that being said, Trump is also suggesting, being fair, that he's going to turn the tables on Joe Biden and possibly have Biden indicted if he's reelected. But again, let me explain this because it's kind of a question on the reality that you're perceiving. Let me show you some of it. NBC News says this. They say, if I don't get immunity, this is Trump writing this, if I don't get immunity, because remember right now that there's a legal case arguing, the Supreme Court's taking it up, whether or not Donald J. Trump, the former president of the United States, has presidential immunity or had presidential immunity at the time of the alleged crimes he's being accused of. And of course, historically, presidents had very broad immunity to the extent where they can even pardon people for some of the most severe crimes you can imagine. Look, Barack Obama was pardoning people who were found guilty of being involved with the Weather Underground and terrorist movements that killed police officers and bombed the Capitol building. That was Obama. And of course, if you can pardon somebody for such a severe crime, you would assume the president themselves would also have broad enough immunity for things of that sort. There's, of course, different arguments on this, and Trump is suggesting that, well, look, say he has immunity, say he doesn't, but if you say he doesn't, it's not just him who loses presidential immunity. Joe Biden loses it, Barack Obama loses it, George Bush Jr. loses it, and anybody else who runs for president loses it as well. They could all be held criminally responsible for anything that people deem to be a crime they committed through the acts of, again, directing the country as president of the United States. And the NBC notes that Trump, after saying that if he doesn't get immunity, then crooked Joe Biden doesn't get immunity. And they say that Trump wrote this before criticizing the Biden administration for the record number of migrants crossing into the U.S. southern border, illegal aliens they mean. They're saying its 2021 decision to pull troops from Afghanistan, which of course led to the deaths of many U.S. troops and of course many U.S. supporters, and baselessly claims of Biden engaging in shady business practices with foreign countries. And NBC News is suggesting that those accusations are all baseless. I would say that there's a lot of evidence to that. I don't know how baseless they are. But of course it's tied in with Hunter Biden. The question is whether Biden was actually financially engaged with that. We're still seeing where that's going to go. And Trump continues by saying Joe would be ripe for indictment by weaponizing the DOJ, the Department of Justice, against his political opponent, me, Donald J. Trump. Joe has opened a giant Pandora's box. And Trump continues by stating, as president, I was protecting our country and doing a great job of doing so. Just look around the complete mess that crooked Joe Biden has caused. The least I am entitled to is presidential immunity on fake Biden indictments. And take that as you will. The way that this is being spun by a lot of the media is that Trump is suggesting by saying that Joe Biden would also lose his presidential immunity if the Supreme Court deems that presidents don't have presidential immunity. Obviously, if presidents don't have presidential immunity, they don't just mean if your name is Donald J. Trump. If they rule that presidents don't have immunity, it means all U.S. presidents do not have immunity. And that's what Trump is, of course, saying. But they're taking this in context of Trump suggesting that Biden may have committed crimes and suggesting, based on that Trump may just go after Biden in the same way that Biden is being accused of going after Trump with the weaponization of the government. And again, look, remember, that's NBC News, and they tend to have their opinions, as we all do. Now, look, of course, Bloomberg has been going pretty strong on this narrative quite a bit. I showed you an opinion piece. It's not just limited to that. There's also the allegations that uncensored news itself, that you and I being able to communicate with each other, to post our opinions on social media, to state what we believe is the reality of the world and the news, to discuss things in ways that are not being moderated by fact checkers or alleged fact checkers. That this type of dialogue could destroy democracy itself. Let me show you this. Bloomberg said, "Will 2024 be the year fake news destroys democracy?" And it's actually not just them saying that. This is another big narrative going around. The suggestion is that as we go into 2024, when 41% of the world is going to be having its elections to choose their new leaders, and you have conservatives in many places who might just get elected, the only way to save democracy is to not allow voters to openly discuss and read news. It's not just them saying that. Business Standard said this as well. They said, democracy to face toughest challenge in face of fake news in 2024. And look, remember, this has been something going on for a while now. The World Health Organization has declared that uncensored news, rumors, unvetted information, that this represents a type of infodemic, an information pandemic. And they've suggested that the infodemic is not even just false information, it's just having too much information. There are too many people, too many news outlets, too many individuals able to express their opinions, and people just don't know where to look anymore because the establishment media that once held the gauntlet of moderating all of our information, they've been losing a lot of their support and a lot of their audience. And that is an infodemic according to them because of that. I would say that this is a failing narrative, but the suggestion is that maybe we just need more censorship to save democracy. I would argue this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what democracy is. The fourth estate, the media, right, the journalists, was framed before as the representative of the people. You know, they're the individuals who go and collect information and hold politicians to account. I would say that, of course, many of the things we were told were fake in 2016, 2017, 2018, all the way, frankly, up until now. A lot of the things we were told were fake narratives and unsubstantiated claims have turned out to have been true. We also were fed a lot of fake news that we were told was unquestionable reality. The rumors of Hunter Biden's laptop being Russian disinformation, that was a lie. The rumors that Donald J. Trump worked with Russia to rig our elections, that was a lie. The list could go on and on and on. And they're suggesting that if you dare question the establishment narratives, that you are guilty of threatening democracy itself. And I'd say the opposite is probably true in many of these cases. The lies of a lot of these outlets have been exposed, and the fact that they've been manipulating information for political reasons is being exposed. They're losing their audiences because people have lost trust in them, not because people are being, misled by unsubstantiated rumors and just don't know where to look for information. People go to what they believe is true based on, credibility of sources. And frankly, a lot of the establishment has lost its credibility because they keep lying to people. Look, The Guardian is suggesting that actions to prevent voter fraud themselves are threats to democracy. Imagine that. That, of course, they're saying that, this could be the year where we see elections under threat. Democracy is being threatened. And, of course, people might even try to rig elections. Remember we saw that? They're suggesting that the nature of, rigging elections is not actually technically rigging elections, but instead people who believe that elections have been rigged taking actions to pass laws that will increase the security of the elections. And that if you want to increase the security of elections, that is an act of rigging an election. I'm not even joking. This is one of the main narratives going around. They're saying that, again, The Guardian saying that since increased security for the elections appears to be based on the idea that the 2020 election was rigged, anything like counting ballots by hand and similar acts of election integrity, maybe like voter ID, that this may just be an act of election interference in itself. The Guardian said, anti-democracy playbook has new threats in store for the U.S. in 2024. And that Guardian piece Just goes over all the claims from Republicans that the elections in 2020 were rigged and how Republicans are facing legal attacks because of those claims. Of course, you have a lot of them getting sued or facing racketeering charges in Georgia, which is kind of falling apart right now because Fani Willis is being accused of possibly having an affair with one of the main people Biden was meeting with to begin that whole thing, including the meetings that took place the very day that he appointed Jack Smith as special counsel to investigate his political enemy, Donald J. Trump. That's another story for another day. We'll get into it. But again, The Guardian is suggesting, right, it frames these suggestions that, the elections may have been rigged, that these are threats to democracy for the very act of suggesting that elections could be rigged, and that these individuals are criminals for facing criminal charges, and that if they get elected, then calls for similar criminal investigations on the other side are themselves also threats to democracy. In other words, if they dare do to the other side what the other side has done to them, they are threats to democracy, whereas the other side, by doing the things they're accusing conservatives of doing, are actually trying to defend democracy by legally targeting all their political opponents. Are you getting the way this logic is working? Again, this is a broad narrative. According to PBS, Americans themselves, all of us, all just seem to agree that democracy is on the line. And, they do state pretty accurately, in my opinion. I would kind of agree with PBS on this. Each side accuses the other of this. They're saying that basically, Democrats are accusing Republicans of, believing democracy is under threat. And, of course, Republicans are saying that Democrats are representing a threat to democracy. Each side accuses the other of the same thing. And of course, I'd say, well, we can just look at the facts and judge based on that. But let me show you what they're saying. PBS said that a poll from the Associated Press, Newark Center for Public Affairs Research, found that 62% of adults say democracy in the U.S. could be at risk depending on who wins next fall, right? Whether Trump or maybe Vivek Ramaswamy or maybe Joe Biden or who knows, maybe even Nikki Haley or somebody else entirely. They say that majorities of Democrats, 72%, and Republicans, 55%, feel the same way, but for different reasons. It says President Joe Biden has attempted to paint a dystopian future if GOP frontrunner and former President Donald Trump returns to the White House after promising to seek retribution against opponents and declining to rule out that he would abuse the powers of office. Trump did say that he is their retribution, right? He was telling his supporters, I am your retribution. He did say that. The idea of abusing powers of the office, that's an opinion, basically. They're suggesting that if Trump on day one wants to, deport illegal aliens, which he's saying he'll do, that is an abuse of power. They're playing with narratives a little bit here. It says the former president, Donald Trump, has tried to flip the narrative lately, saying the election subversion and documents cases against him show Biden has weaponized the federal government to prosecute a political opponent. He has called Biden the destroyer of American democracy, which Trump has said. And again, this is a question of your opinion on what's actually happening in this country. Now look, in my opinion, it's relatively fair saying that both Republicans and Democrats, to varying degrees, generally the majority do believe that democracy is under threat, and that really the difference is, which side you believe is a threat to it. And again, it is a shared opinion of many people, both on the right and the left, being real. And apparently as well, though, some of Trump's opponents are so concerned about this that it's affecting their sleep. Daily Mail said that the former First Lady, Michelle Obama, sat down for an hour-long interview with On Purpose podcast Jay Shetty, and among the things Obama said kept her up at night was the 2024 election and Americans taking democracy for granted. And she said, Michelle Obama stated, I am terrified about what could possibly happen because our leaders matter. So, what is the actual threat to democracy? Where did this new narrative push start? Well, look, if you trace this back to its origin, Because I showed you a few examples. You see article by article by article, news outlet by news outlet by news outlet, pushing this narrative that democracy is under threat, that there is a threat to the American public, and that suggesting that in order to save democracy, it may be necessary to maybe remove Trump from the ballot for 2024. It may be necessary to use the systems of justice to prosecute and attack him. It may be necessary to make it so that Americans cannot vote in order to protect our right to vote. And where does this narrative come from, folks? It turns out this is actually the campaign line for Joe Biden. It was outlined in the campaign memo, in fact. This is the actual campaign agenda for 2024 of one of the presidential candidates, Joe Biden. Let me show you this. Bloomberg said, calling Trump a threat to democracy is central to Biden's campaign. This isn't a secret. This is a political agenda. This narrative is part of a political campaign, and it's being framed as if it were some kind of like organic narrative. Apparently, Biden believes this narrative is something that's going to get him votes. They believe this is a narrative that will win voters over for the election. That's what this is really about. This is a campaign. This is a political campaign, disguised as an actual warning from news outlets that there's a threat to America. NBC News said it as well. They said this: Biden argues Trump remains a threat to democracy, a case his campaign thinks resonates with voters. Are you getting now what's going on? They're saying that this narrative that Trump is a threat to democracy, they're saying this because his political campaign believes that that narrative will get them votes. Now look, Biden is also running with this message in his campaign ads. They in fact started rolling these out already. The Guardian said this, that Biden's first 2024 campaign ad, an advertisement, highlights threats to U.S. democracy. Now look, the memo said that they were going to do this. The campaign ad shows them already doing this. And given that this is part of Biden's campaign strategy, his political campaign for 2024, outlined in a campaign memo used in his first campaign ad, and it also raises some questions, I would say, about him recently using his platform as President of the United States, pushing this exact same narrative, notably naming his main political opponent. Now, there's a fine line in America. If you're President of the United States and you're also running for re-election, to what extent do you use your position of power as president to campaign? There are some legal issues with this. Remember, Trump was almost like, Trump was being attacked when he was president on the very suspicion that he was doing this. They tried, calling for Trump's removal from office and prosecution because he was accused of doing this. And here you have Biden possibly actually doing what Trump was accused of doing before. New York Times notes that Biden condemns Trump as dire threat to democracy in a blistering speech. And look, Biden has done these soul of the nation speeches before. You might remember the one with the, blood red background and this is black and red thing, and he's calling Trump and MAGA the threats to the American system. He's done it before, so you could argue whether it's really about the campaign. But when you have a campaign memo and a campaign ad stating their narrative, their main, line they're going to be using to try to win the election, and then Biden comes out right after that and gives a speech pushing that same narrative, it does look like this is more of a campaign ad being disguised as an official presidential speech. That's the controversy with this. CNN noted that Biden makes impassioned argument Trump could destroy American democracy as he opens 2024 campaign. In other words, it's a blurred line of whether Biden is campaigning or giving speeches as President of the United States on this. Something, again, Trump was accused of before, and they were calling that a crime when Trump was doing it. The Guardian says Biden attacks Trump as grave threat to democracy in rousing 2024 speech. Headline, Bloomberg, they say this, Biden says democracy on ballot as he makes case against Trump. I could show you headline after headline of them saying this. Now look, it really seems this is a partisan political narrative. This is something meant as a slogan for the 2024 elections. And they're using it and mixing it with this, what appears to be a political slogan being used as again, from the position of president. Also something being framed as just organic news coverage from all the big corporate media. I started by showing you a lot of the headlines going around where all the media is saying the same thing. It looks, frankly, like a lot of the big corporate media is pushing a political ad campaign in the disguise of just organic news coverage. And I would say this is confusing voters in a way that, in my opinion, could be an actual threat to democracy. If the media establishment is running campaign ads under the guise of organic news coverage, not telling people that this is part of a campaign memo from Biden, something being used as his main campaign slogan, while he's mixing again political advocacy with the political speech of the president, there are some real issues with this. And it looks like this is a strategy, at least in my opinion, of flipping the script. Trump has been showing evidence of election fraud. In fact, he just published a big list of items that he claims at least are real points of undisputable evidence. There are pushes to close loopholes in the election system based on the issues that have been raised. And this type of action to secure our elections is being framed as a type of political extremism meant to destroy democracy. That's the way this narrative is working. And the legal attacks on Trump, the weaponization of the government, as Republicans would call it, including the attempts to even remove Trump from the ballot to make it so that people who support him are not able to even vote for him, are being framed as legitimate, while suggesting that people behind these attacks, targeting their political opponents, are just, while anyone who suggests the people bringing these attacks should be investigated, they're framing this as tyrants and dictators. In other words, you have a political system attacking its political enemies. They're accusing, they're saying that by attacking their political enemies, they're defending democracy. But when the other side suggests, not actually doing it, that they may investigate the other side and see whether this was a crime, that this is a threat to democracy. If they're saying that this is a threat to democracy, then why is it not a threat to democracy when it's coming currently as we're watching it from the other side? Again, it's a kind of a play on narratives, in my opinion. The whole threat to democracy line, again, in my opinion, just looks like a political narrative that is being designed to flip the script. It looks like a political narrative meant to accuse others of what they themselves are doing, to make it look like they are not trying to, interfere with the elections, to make it look like they are not attacking their political opponents, and instead to frame those actions as attempts to save democracy, ironically by doing the exact thing that they're saying the other side might do that they claim represents a threat to democracy. It's a very kind of convoluted, loop they have going on, but in my opinion, again, and I want to make it clear this is my opinion, I think this is just them accusing others of what they themselves are doing and trying to hide the nature of what they're doing through that action. It's just a big narrative, folks, and this is the way it's being framed. That said, let's jump into some questions. Let's see here. Judith Yakim, good seeing you here. One sec. You're saying, well, if it isn't, just accuse them of what you're doing again. Yeah, I think you posted that before I said it as well. You said, like, globally attack any political candidate who wants to hold on to people's right to decide about their lives. They are being honest, but talking about themselves. I would agree with you. Yeah, they are being honest. There are threats to democracy right now. But I think they're being a little misleading on who is actually the threat to democracy. I would say that if you're weaponizing the legal system to go after your political opponents, you're probably undermining democracy, the process through which people can choose to elect who they want to. If Joe Biden was meeting with the Maine prosecutor who was allegedly having an affair with Fani Willis, the DA, to bring charges in the district of Fani Willis. I'd say that's probably a threat to democracy. If Joe Biden was meeting with the guy who, or the Biden administration was meeting with the guy who was having an affair with one of the DAs bringing these charges, and they're stating their own political bias while doing it, and then Joe Biden, his administration appoints special counsel Jack Smith literally on the exact same day to bring charges in the district where this person's having an affair with the guy part of the meeting where they planned the whole thing, I'd say that's probably a threat to democracy. If you want to strike your main political opponent from the ballot and make it so people can't vote for them, I'd say that's a threat to democracy. And if you're trying to block any actions to reassure voters that the elections are actually secure, I'd say, yeah, that's probably a threat to democracy. The problem is that these are being framed as actions to defend democracy, ironically. You gotta destroy it to protect it, apparently, is the narrative, the true nature of this narrative, I'd say. Ashley from California, you're saying, is threat to democracy just another term for threat to Democrats? I actually think that's what it is. I'd say not just Democrats, because the way they're framing this narrative is a global threat. They're saying that populism, if you have which just means basically, it's a name. It's like name calling, but historically it has meaning. A populist government is a government that represents the average people of a country. The term comes from ancient Rome, and that's what it was. It's a government that represents the average person rather than the political elites. And I mean this in the very true historical sense. This had to do with the, of course, Roman system where, you could only be part of the political system if you were born into like this lineage. They had a class system of the Senate leadership class and kind of just the broad masses, right? The populari and so on. And they were saying that if a government represents the masses of the country, the average citizen, then that was a populist. They're calling Trump an individual who represents a populist narrative because, he represents the average American, essentially. He's saying America first. And this is being framed as nationalism and Hitler and so on like that. That's the way they're framing that type of government where, hey, imagine a government that represents its own people. What a concept, right? They're framing this as a threat to the global political system itself, because the individuals, at least as far as I see it, the individuals currently in power are representing a new type of political system, which is globalism. They believe in this global agenda, the green agenda, the global, woke agenda, the race narratives and race politics, global equity, open borders. All of these things are an agenda being pushed by most countries on earth. And they're suggesting that the average citizen of each country not wanting that future and voting for a candidate who will not drive us towards the future they want is threatening the entire global system. And because of that, they're suggesting that, ironically, people voting and not wanting what they're offering is a threat to democracy. And so I'd say they're confused about what democracy is. I would say that actually the individuals trying to stop that process are themselves trying to overthrow democracy and are trying to become global, totalitarian dictators. If you want to prevent people from choosing the future they want, yeah, that's not democracy. I'm sorry. And frankly, I'd say that the global world order they've been presenting is just not appealing to people in the way they maybe believe it would. And of course, I think they just believe that they're smarter than people, and maybe people don't know what they really want. That's kind of the way this weird thought process is working for those folks. Again, as far as I see it. Let's see, another question from It's Me. You're saying accuse your enemy of what you're doing as you're doing it to create confusion. Carl Useless Leech Marks. Yeah, there you go. Perfect quote. Accuse your enemy of what you're doing as you're doing it to create confusion. And you cite that quote to Karl Marx. Actually, yeah, Saul Alinsky also talked about doing that. You know, you accuse others of what you yourself are doing. This is a common communist tactic, something they've done over and over again. Bruce Butler, you're saying, hey, Josh, why is it that the liberals, threaten to leave the country if their opponent is elected? You never hear that from the other side. Anyone who believes in this country would never leave it. I agree, actually, and I'd say it's because they support this globalist system. I think what's happening right now is that the political agenda that a lot of the political establishment is getting behind is a globalist agenda. The green policies, the international agreements on that, the World Economic Forum type policies of global corporatism trying to subvert the political process, what they call multi-stakeholder capitalism, suggesting that, you know, non-governmental organizations, businesses, and so on should have a role in influencing political policy. And that this kind of shared system where you have your elected leaders and you have your unelected leaders represents a type of new world order. These are globalist policies being adopted through most of Europe, being kind of forced, ironically, out of places in Africa and Latin America. And if the agenda gets derailed in one country, well, you can still see the agenda being carried out in other countries. And so these folks, while they see it being derailed in the U.S., they think, hey, I could just move to Canada, or I can move to, you know, France or Germany, and I get the same thing because it's a global agenda. Ironically, they're not talking about moving to good old, you know, North Korea or, you know, Southern Africa or something like that. They're not talking about that. You'd have to ask why. I think they should be a little more equitable in the countries they say they're going to move to, because I think that, frankly, them suggesting they all want to move to, like, you know, rich white countries just seems a little racist. I think they should maybe consider moving to, like, Uganda or maybe North Korea or maybe even China. I think that they should just be a little more equitable in the countries they threaten to move to demonstrate that they truly believe in what they claim they believe in. You know, maybe they'll flee to Little St. John's. Maybe this is an Epstein thing. You know, let's see here. Terry Baker, you say, I agree 100% about continuing the Electoral College. You say it is one of the most brilliant accomplishments of the Founding Fathers. And I would agree with that. Actually, I think the genius of the Founding Fathers is only being fully demonstrated over the past, you know, eight years or so in the U.S. Because what the Founding Fathers, America was founded by literal insurrectionists. Let that sink in. George Washington, you know, all those folks, they were actual insurrectionists. John Adams, you know, Benjamin Franklin, they were all insurrectionists. They carried out an act of insurrection against the British government. They overthrew British rule from America and created their own country. That is what they did. They could have been killed as traitors for doing that. They won, and they formed a new country. And a lot of the way that America was established was a reinterpretation of the role of what government is. Government is meant to serve the people, not the other way around. You as a citizen of a nation, the very nature of the social contract, as some of the folks at the time would have framed it, the very nature of that was that people maybe give some of their money, maybe in the form of taxes, although there was very little taxation or none at all, depending on where you were at in the United States at the time. You give some of your sovereignty, to an extent, over to a government in order to get something in exchange. You want them to protect you, to defend your life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness, to protect you from, let's say, robbery or plunder, as some folks would frame it, or, you know, foreign invasion. That government represents a type of shield against tyranny. And the very nature of government is to protect the rights we are given by God. The rights do not come from government, the rights come from God. And if people believe the government is not actually protecting those rights, then according to the Declaration of Independence, the Founding Fathers said that the people of the country have the right to overthrow that government and institute a new form of government. The way they established the American system is checks and balances. They made it very, very, very difficult to overturn this social contract. The very nature of what government is, that it serves, that it protects our God-given rights, not that we serve it as like, slaves to a broader system. And of course, we're seeing now the genius of how difficult it is to get rid of our constitutional rights, where you have your federal government, you have your three branches of government, all of which can keep each other in check. The Supreme Court can challenge the President of the United States. The Supreme Court can challenge Congress. Congress can challenge the President. It's very difficult to violate the rights of the country, the rights of the people of the country, unless you control everything. We're finding that even if you control everything, you also have states that also have their own systems of government that can challenge the constitutional basis of even the federal government, down to even the sheriffs, sheriffs being elected officials, can choose to not enforce laws if they believe the laws themselves are not in line with the Constitution or violate the Constitution. There are checks and balances at every single level, even down to the average American citizen, where if you get targeted by laws that have been passed by every single level, that the Congress passed it, the President signed off on it, the Supreme Court has not taken it up, the local government in your state is not defending you on it, the sheriff has enforced it and you've gone to prison for it, you can sue them. And you can bring that all the way up to the Supreme Court and make them take up that case, and you can change the laws of the entire country and throw something out if it is shown to be unconstitutional. That is the degree to which the Founding Fathers created checks and balances to make sure that we cannot be brought to our knees against some kind of tyrannical dictator. The genius of it is incredible. And of course, even the Electoral College, as we see that the way that the Electoral College works is a way to, of course, ensure the integrity of our election system. Is also, I think, a very frankly ingenious idea as well. Let's see here. Let's see, something to airplane. I can't. They're emojis. You're saying, well, all these. Oh, sorry, free to be, not airplane. Free to be. You're saying, will all these illegal immigrants be allowed to vote in 2024? Is that part of the plan? There are some accusations of this currently. There were, for example, in Arizona, you might have seen some of the viral posts going around where people have posted excerpts from the election laws in Arizona currently. And it does seem to say, based on the technical wording, that if you do not have proof of citizenship, that you can still vote in federal elections. Now, they're not technically saying that illegal aliens can vote, but they are saying to some extent that you do not need proof of citizenship to vote. And the concern is that some people, even though we could assume it's kind of illegal, that they may choose to vote despite that. We have seen examples of that taking place regardless of that already. There are many examples in the United States of illegal aliens voting in our elections, or just non-citizens voting in our elections. Already in some states you have it where non-citizens can vote in local elections. That is not able to be applied to federal elections legally, but if they just open the door and say, hey, you can do it, just don't say it, yeah, that's a big problem. And again, that is already happening in some parts of the U.S. I would actually argue, though, that even without that, mass illegal immigration does represent a type of election interference, mainly because of the way that redistricting works, where districts are decided to some degree by population, and also the way that House members within Congress are appointed. Different areas are given more representation based on the population. And, of course, when they do the national census, the Census Bureau goes door to door and counts every single person who's in a district or county or whatever else. The number of people in that county determine how many elected officials you get in the House of Representatives, which plays a huge role, of course, in our process. We see now Republicans have control of the House, and they can launch all these investigations. They can have these committees. They can impeach the President of the United States, or at least vote to impeach him. Those investigative committees are extremely valuable. And if you have, for example, a political faction flooding a district with new people, non-citizens, illegal aliens, whatever you want to call them, flooding it with new people. When they go and count the census, they don't ask you if you're a citizen or not. In fact, they made it so you're not even allowed to. They count non-citizens, they count illegal aliens, they count people violating our laws, because a population is a population. And that is used to alter the amount of representation given to that district. And so I would say that without a doubt, even if they don't vote, mass illegal immigration is changing the populations of different counties and areas of the United States. And through that, it will impact our political system, because at the very least, if nothing else happens, it will change the amount of representation you're going to get in these districts that they choose to ship all these people to. And again, not to mention the issue of redistricting, which district maps can significantly alter the outcome of elections as well, especially when it comes to the Electoral College and such. Elizabeth, you're saying it's crazy how fast our nation has changed course. Back when 9/11 happened, most people, even the stars, sounded like patriots. I remember. Remember when Proud to Be an American was the song of the whole country? You're saying except the ones pushing the Patriot Act. Yeah, thanks Bush. Now you can imagine what our national reaction might look like. Well, geez, speaking of 9/11 and what the national reaction might look like, did you all see the viral videos going around where people influencers on TikTok were reading the letter of Osama bin Laden justifying terror attacks, and they were agreeing with it? That's how far we've come. It's not even the issue of patriotism anymore, that you have young people agreeing with mass murderers and actual terrorists trying to destroy the United States. And it wasn't necessarily a Republican Democrat thing, just emphasizing how far we've gone from the basic principles of American patriotism. Talk about threats to democracy. I'd say wait till those people can vote if you want to see threats to democracy, or wait till they do vote. Maybe some of them are already of voting age, and it is unfortunate. I'm an older millennial. I'm in my late 30s, almost 40 years old. I feel like I grew up in a different country, frankly, and I would say a lot of millennials probably feel that way. When I was in high school, we didn't feel the crazy race politics. I had friends who were, thinking back now, one of my best friends was Italian, I had another friend who was Mexican and Native American, I had a friend who was black, and that was my friends group, and we never thought of it in terms of race. I never thought I'm going to go hang out with my Native American friend today, or I'm going to go hang out with my white friend today, or my black friend today. I never thought that. We didn't think like that at the time. If you went to go watch a movie, and let's say, do you remember Blade with Denzel Washington? Nobody said, "Oh, brave black actor." You said, "Oh, I like Denzel Washington. He's a good actor." You didn't think of him based on his race. We didn't have this lens where we judged things by, skin color or whatever else. And, sure, there was racism, but, we kind of made fun of it back then. If you don't believe me, go watch the Dave Chappelle show and watch the kind of humor we had back then. The country's come very far from that, and The idea of national unity, regardless of our racial or cultural differences or even religious differences, was not such a dividing factor. Even political differences were not so divisive at the time. Frankly, I didn't really care if my friends, were Republicans or Democrats or Libertarians or whatever else. It wasn't something we cared about. It wasn't an issue back then, and it's unfortunate to see that has been whittled away. That the tensions between the different groups in this country have been sharpened. I would partly blame Obama for that, frankly. Just being totally blunt, I would partly blame Obama for that. Because that culture that existed in America, the national cohesion regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of political stance, that changed under Obama. When he started rolling out all these race politics and so on, and he started trying to demonize people based on their race, and propped up things and started these fires across the country and looting and rioting, that was Obama. And maybe it would have happened without him. I don't know, but I can say that I frankly don't like the direction we've gone in, where we just don't get along with each other like we used to. I would say that patriotism is understanding that there is a unifying factor between us regardless of our differences. And I do hope that we rediscover that personally. Where we can, it doesn't mean you accept everything. It doesn't mean you relinquish your political views or whatever else. It just means that you don't see it as something that makes you hate somebody who's different from you. In my opinion, I can disagree with people while not hating them. That's I think one of the things that's necessary to have a country, and that is for me part of what patriotism is. Norway for Trump. You're saying Marxism is the most lethal ideology in all of human history. They have killed more than 1 billion human beings in a little over 100 years. Let that sink in. Without a doubt, Marxism is the most lethal ideology in all of human history. I don't know about 1 billion. It wouldn't surprise me if it was 1 billion, if you count all the wars and so on that has been tied to communist revolutions and communist subversion. Maybe that is the case. If you go by the Black Book of Communism, which documents a lot of the actual genocides carried out under communism, you're looking at between like 50 million and 70 million dead, based on new numbers that have come out, based on credible science, credible studies of actual records and so on. The Chinese Communist Party alone killed somewhere between 70 million and 100 million people. That alone. There are some estimates that put the death toll based on current estimates of communism at about 150 million. And of course, if you want to expand that to the wars that have been sparked by communist movements, to the many genocides that were rooted in communist subversion that are not taken as such, to even international terrorism and the many wars that have happened under that, without a doubt, it would be significantly higher. I don't know what the full number would be. And if you take into account even just the chaos and harm it has caused to humanity, without a doubt, communism, Marxism is the most lethal, most destructive, most disgusting political system that the world has ever witnessed. We've documented, at least, there's nothing that even comes close. And you want to talk about threats to democracy, I'd say communism is a real threat to democracy. Really. All right, folks, that said, I am reporting from Taiwan right now. Join me tomorrow. I want to go into, talking about threats to democracy. I'll show you some real ones. The Chinese Communist Party is actively trying to interfere with the Taiwanese elections. And look, we hear a lot about election interference. It's real in this case. I'll show you tomorrow what has actually been going on. And this is important because, remember, in the United States, a lot of the election interference was traced to China, in fact. For example, running some of the key components of our election system, a lot of it was tied to China. And of course, if the Chinese Communist Party successfully influences the elections in Taiwan, which the vote's going to be held on Saturday, and I will be covering that here locally. And of course, I'll be publishing a special feature to explain the impact of whatever happens afterwards. Again, so stay tuned for that. Without a doubt, the Chinese Communist Party, if it works, they're going to take the lessons of what works and apply it elsewhere. And as we enter a state where actually in a very real sense, 41% of the countries on earth are going to be having presidential elections this coming year, over the next couple of years, even more. If the CCP finds a working model for interfering with elections, they're going to use it elsewhere as well. And so tune in tomorrow. We'll go over this. I'll show you the actual evidence, the actual cases, and the actual stuff being shown right now. And it's pretty shocking. Again, I'm in Taiwan right now, and I'll be here till next week. That said, folks, stay tuned for more coverage on this. I will see you tomorrow morning, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And as always, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate all of you. Please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free.